Hello and welcome to American History 215 Online. This week we are discussing Chapter 10, which is the Market Revolution. And there's a lot jam-packed into this chapter, so let's go ahead and get started so we can get through it all. Okay, learning outcomes. Describe the economic system known as the American system. List the three specific parts of the market revolution in early 19th century America and evaluate how the United States developed during this era. Describe the growth of America's middle class during the first half of the 1800s and discuss some of the stronger movements toward reform during the era. Okay, so we have something called the American system. After the War of 1812, America became more isolated, kind of drawing itself in. There had been a lot of wars and they kind of wanted to get away from that. They wanted to strengthen its economy and protect itself from further excursions, but they also wanted to promote American goods. So they focused on keeping American goods within the United States and having Americans buy American goods as well. Okay. So the market revolution, really, the definition is here in your book, umbrella term for many economic and social changes that took place between the years of 1812 and 1860. Many of the farms were focusing on a single crop. Instead of being self-sufficient and making everything, they were focusing on a specific crop, and then they were buying and selling from other places. To buy and sell from other places, what do you need? You really need to have some transportation to get your markets and goods all throughout America. So that's one thing that really happened, was transportation. Okay, at the dawn of the 1800s, more than 80% of the American labor force was agricultural, but by 1850, 55%. So you're seeing that not everybody has to be a farmer, okay? People can be things like local salesmen, lawyers, factory workers, marketers, economists, and bookkeepers. Okay, they really focused on the home market. Okay, the second generation of American politicians. So these people did not fight in the Revolutionary War. They did not fight in the Revolutionary War. So this new generation of politicians did not have the same distrust of the central government as the old generation, because they did not fight in the Revolutionary War. So they started some nationalistic programs, and some of those were proposed by Alexander Hamilton, and this is called the American System. And you have the definition here. Economic plan based on the idea that federal government should encourage economic enterprise. So they wanted the large government to kind of work with them. And Henry Clay from Kentucky and John C. Calhoun from South Carolina really began a vision of a federal government that would encourage economic enterprise or help it. So they did a few things. They created roads and canals collectively, and this is called internal improvements to get your goods and to where the market is within the United States. They developed secure economic institutions such as banks, and they provided security for America's economic interests through high tariffs. So you have the new national bank, and then, Jackson was a huge anti-bank guy, and so he kind of blocked it, and then there was a second Bank of the United States after him. And most of the Republicans mostly supported a national bank after this, after Jackson kind of struck it down. Federalists opposing it. Times had changed since the Federalist era, and you have that change over time, which happens in history. There is a change over time. Okay, so you have the tariff of 1816, incoming goods, stiff rate of 25%. That's a lot. This meant that the goods in the American system would be American, so more people were buying American than before. Okay, you have some court cases that happened. One was called Dartmouth College versus Woodward, which forbade state legislators from altering college charters in order to control them. So they wanted more self-sufficient colleges making their own decisions and not in the pockets of states. Protected hemisphere. the northern boundary at the 49th parallel between the U.S. and Britain and Canada in 1819, it won from Spain, both Florida and lands extending nearly to today's Oregon, all in exchange for parts of Texas. Now the United States extended from the southern tip of Florida to the current day boundary with Canada, and from the Atlantic almost to the Pacific, although it still did not claim America's Southwest. And you have to understand, when the Europeans came to America, the land was not really new. New is really a word that is problematic because someone owned it. They just ignored it and conquered them and just kind of took it from them. And that's something you need to really understand. You have the new dominance was expressed by this the clear statements in the Monroe Doctrine. You have to understand this dominance. This is our land. God gave it to us, and all these different things that were kind of added religiously because it's not in the Bible. You have to understand this is like a movement of entitlement for Europeans. And that is also in your analysis words. It's called Eurocentrism, where Europeans feel like the world, they're the center of the world, or ethnocentrism, where they're feeling like their ethnicity has a right to take lands away from other ethnicities that don't, because they consider them pagan. But not looking at the reverse side, that the Native Americans may look at us and say, or look at the Europeans and say, well, I think you're pagan and I disagree, So you have all these different philosophies coming in from ethnocentrism and Eurocentrism. The Monroe Doctrine, the Declaration of 1823, proclaiming that any European nation attempting to colonize Latin America would be treated as a party hostile to the United States. President James Monroe announced that the Western Hemisphere was the domain of the United States and was to remain separate from the affairs of Europe. Okay, that sounds really great, except for the Latin American people had their own rights, and they had their own thoughts, and they had their own agency to want to do what they wanted. So basically, it was almost like one bully telling another bully, this is our land. And then there's people on that land that they intend to dismiss, overcome, whatnot. So the Monroe Doctrine is also problematic. They were trying to keep other European nations out. Okay, some people weren't really for this. War hero turned politician Andrew Jackson was really enjoyed the fruits of this plan, but he eventually saw it as a vehicle for corruption, which Andrew Jackson and corruption is a whole nother issue that we'll get to very soon. Okay, so combining this tariffs, internal improvements, national bank, what was happening that was really good for the Americans was they were producing what they did best. So whatever part of the country was, they were producing the crops that were best for that area of the country. They had transportations and communications revolution. Okay, so you had the Turnpike era where they were building roads. The Canal era, there were actually canals in Cincinnati. It's super fascinating if you look at that, where the canals were, where there's actually streets now. Steamboats could go upstream. So instead of, if you're up in the north wanting your goods to go south, but you couldn't go north to sell them. Now with the invention of the steamboat, you could sell your goods north, going against the current. Also the railroad era. With railroads, you don't have to rely on waterways and their natural endings. Okay. Canal era, I talked about Cincinnati, the Erie Canal, an artificial river connecting Buffalo and the offshore Lake Erie to Albany. So that was huge, allowing the goods to get inland from the Atlantic seaboard. Okay. Mules would tow barges on ropes through these canals. You have 4 reasons why opening the Erie Canal was a landmark event. I thought that was super interesting. Financial first. It had a huge financial impact. When you tried to move 1 ton of goods from Buffalo, New York, to New York City, before it cost 19 cents per mile. After the canal, it only cost 1 cent. That is just a measurable difference. Copycats, you had one canal. With the area, other cities did the same thing and saw how good it was and profitable, creating a major metropolis, really encouraged growth in New York City, a change in farming, really a cheap way to move goods to market. The steamboat, I already talked about the going upstream. Railroads were also good. It has several listed on page 172. You don't have to rely on natural waterways as the endpoints. Railroads did not freeze either in the wintertime. Much faster travel than mules. Okay, what was happening to the north? There was a huge diversity in economy. It was really doing a wonderful thing with this market economy, but the south was not diversifying. And it was going to hurt them in the future because they kind of refused to diversify. There was a revolution. The telegraph, for the first time, the telegraph was sending communication for the first time in human history, free from the realm of physical transit. So instead of, sending it the Pony Express or mail or, that sort of thing, it was the first time it was like not traveling by actual physical means, which we understand that now today with the internet and that sort of thing. Commercialized farming. Family no longer had to produce everything. They could just pick one crop. Now, we really need to talk about the cotton gin, because before it might have been a lot easier for the South to relinquish slaves until the cotton gin. Eli Whitney had a new invention called the cotton gin, where you could put the cotton plant in and it would separate it very quickly, because it's really hard to take the little particles out if you've ever seen a cotton plant. This was a revolutionary technology, and it made the South hang on to slavery even more. Now, cotton is extremely labor intensive, and you did not want to do it if you were a white European. That's why they had free labor in the South in the form of slavery, owning humans. Now, if you understand, in the North, they had cheap labor, the factories and the diversification, but the cheap labor was immigrants coming over and treating them very poorly, but paying them, okay? All right, and there was just no diversity in the South, and that really was a problem later on. Okay, the Missouri Compromise comes along because they're not sure, should we make Missouri free or should we make them slaves? So Henry Clay came up with a compromise, making Missouri a slave state and Maine would be a free state, and then this embroiled battle keeps going on and they don't want to let go. Industrialization came about. I really want to talk about industrialization later, but with industrialization, before you had women who were working, lower class women could work, do different things. But with industrialization, society kind of put a real stamp of gender on where people were. So you have private sphere. Women were only really allowed in the private sphere, which would include home and church, keeping them home to take care of the children. Kind of dividing families, where before, when it was an agricultural-based economy, you would have more of a partnership in the marriage, where both mother and father were around the children to raise them. Both mother and father worked in the fields. Both mother and father did a lot of things together as a team, partnership. And then you have this division of labor, and you have some different societal problems that come from it. So men were allowed in both the public and private sphere, and women were kind of kept out. And we are going to read The Cult of True Womanhood, and you'll see this kind of played out in society in a better way. Huge social change with the market revolution. Dramatic changes. There were some single women who were hired for factories, and they were not treated well, and it talks about that. But you had to be single. Once you were married, you were just society kind of pushed you into a spot where you had to remain home. All right. Catholics coming in, Protestants being angry with the Irish and the Great Irish Famine, immigrants coming in for cheap labor. You have reformers, the creation of the middle class with managers and that sort of thing. Public and private sphere we already talked about. You have a lot of mention of the cult of true womanhood, which we will talk about later. The women's movement, both blacks and whites. Sisters Angelina and Sarah Grimke, Lydia Maria Child, Maria Chapman, and Lucretia Mott, all fighting for women's rights.